At 8:47 in the morning on November 12, 1985, an individual clad in a gray suit presented a boarding pass to a gate agent at JFK International Airport. He took 3 steps toward the jetway before 6 FBI agents converged, guns drawn. His name was Edward Garrett, a Department of Defense analyst, father of 2, and, for the preceding 4 months, a clandestine operative for the Soviet Union. The briefcase he carried contained a counterfeit passport and sufficient evidence to warrant a lifetime prison sentence. The flight he was about to board would have transported him to Vienna, then Prague, and finally Moscow, offering permanent asylum behind the Iron Curtain. His wife was at home in Virginia, preparing breakfast. His Soviet intelligence contacts awaited him in Europe, and the FBI had been meticulously observing his every action for 19 days. The events of the subsequent 60 seconds would shatter a family and bring to light one of the most audacious defection attempts on American soil during the Cold War. However, the truly perplexing question, one that would confound investigators for months, was how an average government employee, burdened by a mortgage and holding a security clearance, had convinced himself he could board an international flight, carrying classified secrets, and simply vanish. Edward Garrett was 41 years old. He had dedicated 16 years to the Department of Defense, most recently within the Strategic Defense Analysis Division, a unit tasked with reviewing classified military assessments and preparing briefings for high-ranking officials. His personnel file depicted him as diligent, dependable, and unremarkable. He had 2 children, a wife named Patricia, who was an elementary school teacher, and a split-level home in Arlington that he had purchased in 1978. His neighbors would later relay to reporters that the Garretts appeared to be the archetypal family featured in advertisements, pleasant and ordinary, the kind who maintained their lawn on Sundays and erected Christmas decorations the day after Thanksgiving. Yet, a transformation had occurred. During the summer of 1985, Garrett began submitting unusual requests at work. He sought access to documents beyond his usual purview, specifically those pertaining to NATO troop deployments and communication protocols. His supervisor, a seasoned bureaucrat named Michael Hriss, initially attributed these requests to professional curiosity, the sort of initiative that reflected favorably during performance evaluations. Garrett exercised caution, never overstepping boundaries or requesting information so sensitive as to trigger an immediate security investigation. Instead, he gradually broadened his access, one document at a time, meticulously assembling a compilation of information that would have held significant value to any entity interested in Western military capabilities during a particularly tense period of the Cold War. What Harris was unaware of, as was everyone at the Department of Defense at the time, was that Garrett had been approached 6 months prior. This encounter occurred in Washington at a conference on defense policy hosted at a hotel near DuPont Circle. A man identifying himself as Dmitry Kusov, claiming to be a trade representative from the Soviet embassy, initiated a conversation with Garrett during a coffee break. The discussion was casual, focusing on the presentations they had just attended, the quality of the hotel's coffee, and the city's traffic. Kusov was charismatic, well-dressed, and spoke English with a subtle accent. He proposed exchanging business cards, perhaps continuing their conversation over dinner at a later time. Garrett, flattered by the attention and perceiving no harm in professional networking, agreed. Their dinners commenced in June. Kusov was generous, taking Garrett to upscale restaurants in Georgetown and ordering bottles of wine that cost more than Garrett earned in a week. He subtly, and with great care, steered their conversations towards Garrett's work. This was not overt. Nothing that would arouse suspicion, merely professional discourse between 2 individuals interested in international affairs. Kusov would allude to the challenges facing the Soviet Union, economic pressures, and the aspiration for stability, while Garrett would offer his own perspectives, informed by the classified briefings he regularly reviewed. It was not until their 4th dinner at a French bistro on M Street that Kusov revealed his true proposition. He did not term it espionage. Rather, he presented it as a business opportunity, a consulting arrangement. The Soviet government, Kusov maintained, sought a deeper understanding of Western defense postures, not for aggressive intentions, but to ensure they were not taken by surprise by NATO exercises or policy shifts that could potentially destabilize the region. They were willing to compensate for insights, for copies of assessments, for anything that might contribute to their peace of mind. The sum Kusov indicated was substantial, $10,000 for the initial package of documents, with the promise of further compensation. Garrett, who had recently learned that his daughter would require costly orthodontic treatment and that his son had been accepted into an expensive private high school they could barely afford, did not immediately refuse. He requested time to deliberate. By July, Garrett had reached a decision. He began photographing documents using a Minox camera provided by Kusov, minuscule rolls of film that could be discreetly concealed within a hollowed-out book or the lining of his briefcase. The initial handover took place in Rock Creek Park, a classic dead drop scenario where Garrett placed the film canister beneath a loose stone near a jogging path and retrieved an envelope filled with $100 bills. The currency was genuine, and the transactions proceeded smoothly. For the first few weeks, Garrett rationalized his actions, convincing himself he was merely exploiting a flawed system, that the information he was supplying was not critically damaging, and that he merited compensation for his expertise. The routine became almost automated. Every 2 weeks, Garrett would remain in his office late into the evening, waiting until the cleaning staff had departed and the building had emptied. He would retrieve files from the secure cabinet to which he had access, spread them out on his desk under the harsh fluorescent lighting, and meticulously photograph each page with the Minox. The camera was remarkable in its simplicity, small enough to fit in his palm, virtually silent, and capable of producing legible images even in low-light conditions. He would return the files before morning, develop the film in his basement darkroom, a space he had established years prior for a brief foray into photography, and prepare the canisters for the subsequent dead drop. The drop locations varied, but adhered to a consistent methodology. Kusov had furnished him with a list of sites across the Washington area, each selected for its accessibility. Sometimes it was Rock Creek Park, other times the grounds of the National Arboretum, or a specific bench near the tidal basin. Garrett would arrive at the designated location during his lunch break or on his commute home, deposit the canister in the prearranged hiding spot, and return several hours later to collect his payment. He never encountered Kusov during these exchanges, which was the intended outcome. The dead drop system ensured that if one of them were under surveillance, the other would remain undetected. The sensitivity of the documents Garrett provided escalated as summer transitioned into autumn. What had begun with relatively innocuous assessments of NATO readiness evolved into something far more perilous. By August, he was photographing threat analyses detailing American intelligence capabilities in Eastern Europe, communication intercepts revealing how the United States monitored Soviet military movements, and strategic assessments outlining vulnerabilities in Western defense networks. Each new set of documents yielded greater financial rewards. The initial sum of $10,000 had increased to $15,000, then $20,000. By September, Garrett had deposited nearly $40,000 into various accounts, meticulously structured to circumvent banking regulations requiring the reporting of large cash transactions. The financial influx altered dynamics. Patricia observed that Edward seemed less concerned about expenses. He had settled their credit card debt without explanation and agreed to Sarah's costly orthodontic treatment without the protracted financial discussions that typically preceded such significant expenditures. When she inquired, he explained that he was undertaking some freelance consulting work, technical writing for a defense contractor that offered substantial compensation but necessitated non-disclosure agreements. Patricia, who had never demonstrated keen interest in the specifics of Edward's professional life, accepted his explanation. Their marriage had settled into a comfortable pattern of separate domains. She managed the household and the children, while he handled his career and finances, and neither probed too deeply into the other's affairs. However, the compartmentalization that facilitated Garrett's clandestine activities also fostered an increasing sense of isolation. He was unable to share the truth with anyone, unable to articulate the persistent, low-level anxiety that accompanied every dead drop, every photographed document, every envelope of cash concealed in his basement. He began to consume more alcohol. What started as a single glass of scotch after dinner escalated to 2 or 3, serving as a means to silence the inner voice that occasionally whispered that his actions would eventually lead to his downfall. He told himself it was a temporary measure, that he would continue for a few more months, accumulate sufficient savings to secure his family's future, and then devise a method to extricate himself from the arrangement. Kusov harbored different intentions. In late September, during one of their increasingly infrequent in-person meetings at a restaurant in Alexandria, Kusov's demeanor notably shifted. The warm camaraderie that had marked their earlier interactions gave way to a more businesslike and insistent tone. Kusov explained that the information Garrett had been providing was valuable and had been well received in Moscow. However, he conveyed concerns regarding sustainment. American counterintelligence, Kusov cautioned, was perpetually vigilant, always seeking to identify patterns. And while their methods had been discreet, no operation was entirely foolproof. Kusov suggested that Garrett commence contemplation regarding long-term arrangements, concerning potential outcomes should his activities be discovered, and whether he had considered the possibility of relocating to a more secure locale. The concept of relocation lingered in the air between them. Garrett comprehended Kusov's implication. Should the FBI ever become aware of his actions, should his access to classified information be unexpectedly terminated, or should agents appear at his office with inquiries, he would require an exit strategy. Kusov presented an attractive scenario: a comfortable existence in Moscow, employment as a consultant for Soviet defense ministries, an apartment in a desirable neighborhood, and immunity from American legal proceedings. The Soviet Union provided for individuals who aided them, Kusov assured him. Furthermore, they possessed a distinct interest in ensuring that valuable assets such as Garrett did not face incarceration in American penitentiaries. Garrett departed from the dinner, feeling disquieted. What had commenced as a transaction, the exchange of documents for currency, was evolving into something more enduring and perilous. He was no longer merely disseminating secrets. He was being positioned as an individual who might necessitate defection, to forsake his nation and his life, and to vanish behind the Iron Curtain. The notion seemed preposterous upon direct consideration. He possessed a family, a professional career, and a residence in the suburbs. Yet, it also felt unavoidable, as if the moment he had accepted that initial envelope of cash, he had initiated a chain of events beyond his capacity to influence. October ushered in an intensification he had not foreseen. During a clandestine exchange in early October, Garrett retrieved his payment and discovered an additional item within the concealed location: a small envelope containing a counterfeit passport. The document identified him as Robert Mitchell, complete with his photograph, a fabricated birth date, and entry stamps indicating recent sojourns in Western Europe. It also contained a handwritten note in Kusov's precise script, instructing him to safeguard the passport securely and to commit the particulars of his new identity to memory. The note concluded with a solitary sentence that sent a shiver down Garrett's spine. "You may need this sooner than you think." The passport compelled Garrett to confront that which he had been evading. This was not a temporary arrangement from which he could withdraw at his discretion. The Soviets were preparing for contingencies, establishing the infrastructure for his potential defection, and the existence of that forged document signified their view of him as a person worthy of extraction if required. Garrett concealed the passport in the basement, tucked away in a box of old tax returns where Patricia would assuredly not think to look, and attempted to proceed as if nothing had altered. However, everything had transformed. Garrett began to perceive elements he had previously overlooked. Vehicles that seemed to traverse the same route he took to work, an individual in a gray jacket who frequented the coffee shop near his office for 3 consecutive days, the sensation that he was being observed, even when he could not identify the observer or their location. He reassured himself that it was paranoia, that the stress of maintaining his secret was inducing him to perceive threats that were not present. Yet, the apprehension persisted. He became hypervigilant, constantly checking his rearview mirror, altering his routes, and searching for indications of surveillance. The FBI's attention toward Garrett commenced in early October, shortly after they received intelligence from a KGB defector. The defector, whose identity was known only to a select few senior officials, had furnished a detailed inventory of active Soviet intelligence operations within the United States, including the names of several American citizens collaborating with KGB handlers. Garrett's name appeared alongside his job title, a description of the types of documents accessible to him, and most damningly, the clandestine designation the Soviets had assigned him, Nightfall. Special Agent Donald Rhee, a veteran of 15 years with the FBI's Counterintelligence Division, was designated to lead the inquiry. Rhee had managed numerous espionage cases, but something about the Garrett file immediately unsettled him. The individual did not conform to the typical profile. He was not motivated by ideology. There was no indication of pro-Soviet sympathies or animosity towards American policy. He was not a foreign national with conflicted allegiances. He was merely an American bureaucrat facing financial difficulties, rendering him both sympathetic and dangerous. Rhee knew from experience that individuals like Garrett often convinced themselves they were not engaging in truly wrongful conduct, that they could maintain control of the situation, and that they would cease before matters escalated too far. They were invariably mistaken. The surveillance commenced with fundamental measures, monitoring Garrett's communications, tracking his financial transactions, and documenting his movements. Within days, the FBI corroborated the defector's report. Garrett was making regular deposits that substantially exceeded his government salary. Wiretaps revealed cryptic conversations that appeared to involve coded language. Physical surveillance captured him, making stops at locations that lacked any evident purpose. Parking lots, where he would remain in his vehicle for 10 minutes before departing parks where he would take brief detours from established pathways. By mid-October, the FBI had identified Kuzov. Agents photographed Garrett meeting with the Soviet trade representative at restaurants in Georgetown and Alexandria, taking care not to approach too closely to avoid detection. Kuzov was a known entity, a KGB officer operating under diplomatic cover, and his involvement confirmed the gravity of the situation. This was not a low-level intelligence-gathering endeavor. It was the targeted recruitment of a Defense Department employee with access to NATO secrets, and the Soviets were conducting it with professionalism. Rhee faced a consequential decision. The standard protocol would involve confronting Garrett immediately, offering him a deal in exchange for cooperation, and employing him to disseminate misinformation back to the Soviets while constructing a more extensive case against Kuzov and other KGB operatives. However, the timing felt inappropriate. Garrett had only been actively engaged in espionage for a few months, and while the damage was considerable, Rhee suspected there was more to uncover. If they acted too precipitously, they might overlook other participants in the network, other Americans under Kuzov's direction, or broader patterns in Soviet intelligence operations. Rhee opted to permit Garrett to continue. The surveillance would persist, executed with meticulousness and comprehensiveness, documenting every meeting, every clandestine exchange, every classified document Garrett accessed. They would assemble an irrefutable case, the type of evidence that would ensure a conviction and project a clear message to anyone else contemplating betrayal of their country. And should Garrett attempt to defect, as the forged passport suggested he might, they would be prepared. Garrett perceived the walls constricting, even if he could not articulate the reason. In late October, he informed Patricia that he had been assigned to a special project that might necessitate travel, planting the seeds for an explanation should he need to depart abruptly. He began consolidating his finances, withdrawing cash in smaller denominations to avoid drawing attention, and making copies of significant documents. He also started spending more time in his basement, ostensibly engaged in household projects, but in reality organizing the materials he would require should he have to disappear. The forged passport, several $1,000s in cash, contact information for Kuzov, and a detailed plan for reaching Vienna and subsequently Moscow. The discussions with Kuzov acquired an air of urgency in early November. During a meeting in a hotel bar near the airport, Kuzov informed Garrett that Moscow harbored concerns regarding his security. There had been an increase in FBI activity surrounding Soviet diplomatic personnel. Nothing specific, but sufficient to warrant caution. Kuzov suggested that Garrett considered taking a respite, perhaps a sojourn to Europe within the coming weeks. He provided a plane ticket, already purchased under the Robert Mitchell alias, scheduled to depart from JFK on November 12th. The itinerary was straightforward: Vienna, then Prague, then Moscow. Upon Garrett's arrival in Vienna, he would be met by Soviet intelligence officers who would facilitate his onward journey. Garrett accepted the ticket, studied the itinerary, and felt the finality of the proposed course of action settle upon him. This was no longer theoretical. If he boarded that flight, if he proceeded with the plan Kuzov had outlined, there would be no returning. He would be leaving behind everything: his wife, his children, his career, his nation. He would spend the remainder of his life in Moscow, working for the very individuals he had been spying for, living under their protection and their dominion. The prospect terrified him. But so did the alternative. If the FBI was closing in, if they possessed evidence of his actions, he faced decades of imprisonment, the ruin of his family, and national disgrace. He made his choice on November 10th, 2 days prior to the scheduled flight. He would proceed. He informed Patricia that he had to travel to New York for an emergency conference with Defense Department officials, a last-minute crisis requiring his particular expertise. He packed 2 suitcases, more than he would require for a business trip, but not so many as to incite immediate suspicion, and included clothing, toiletries, and personal items he would desire for an extended stay. He withdrew $15,000 from their savings account, explaining to Patricia that he required it for an unspecified business expense that would be reimbursed at a later time. On the night of November 11th, Garrett did not sleep. He lay in bed beside Patricia, listening to her breathing, contemplating his children asleep down the hall, and wondering if he was making the correct decision. A part of him wished to awaken her, confess everything, implore forgiveness, and devise an alternative course of action. However, he knew there was no other path. He had transgressed too many boundaries, accepted too much remuneration, divulged too many secrets. The sole uncertainty remaining was whether his future would unfold within the confines of an American penitentiary or a domiciled Moscow residence. When framed in such stark terms, the determination appeared self-evident. In the nascent hours of November the 12th, Garrett arose silently, donning the charcoal apparel he had procured specifically for this journey. He transported his luggage to the automobile, while his family remained in slumber, exercising caution to preclude their disturbance, and deposited a missive upon the kitchen surface. The communication was intentionally ambiguous, conveying regret without explicit detail, articulating a need for absence, assuring contact upon feasibility, and urging the abjuring of apprehension. As he reversed from the driveway, he cast his gaze upwards towards the darkened apertures of his domicile, contemplating the possibility of its final viewing. He navigated towards JFK amidst the pre-dawn gloom, the arterial roadways remarkably devoid of traffic, his thoughts in a torrent of preordained contingencies, and the nascent existence awaiting him in Moscow. Kuzov had assured him of security, suitable lodgings, employment as a consultant for the Soviet Ministry of Defense, and, paramountly, immunity from legal recourse. Garrett harbored no inclination for repatriation to the United States. He arrived at the aerodrome shortly after 6, secured his vehicle in long-term storage, and proceeded towards the international concourse. The facility was commencing its diurnal augmentation with the morning influx, business professionals and vacationers schlepping their effects towards the registration desks. The terminal vibrated with the ambient cacophony of rolling casters and muted pronouncements. Garrett completed his flight registration without incident. He surmounted the security checkpoint utilizing his fabricated identification, presented as Robert Mitchell, and advanced towards the departure portal. He procured a caffeinated beverage and a periodical, assumed a seating position, affording a vista of the tarmac, and permitted himself a measure of repose. Within 2 hours, he would be airborne. In 12 hours, he would be beyond the juridical reach of American law, yet the Federal Bureau of Investigation harbored alternative stratagems. Special Agent Donald Rhee, the principal interrogator in this affair, had strategically deployed his cadre throughout the concourse. 2 operatives were situated proximate to the gate, disguised amongst the travelers, their visages obscured by printed matter. 2 additional individuals stood near the ingress to the jetway, assuming the guise of airline personnel. Rhee himself maintained his vigil within a security office in conjunction with airport constabulary, monitoring radio transmissions and awaiting confirmation of Garrett's arrival at the portal. The warrant for his apprehension had been ratified the preceding evening by a federal magistrate in Manhattan, and Rhee had meticulously coordinated with the United States Attorney's Office to guarantee the unimpeachable validity of the charges. Unauthorized disclosure of classified material and conspiracy to perpetrate espionage. At precisely 8:47, the embarkation process commenced for Flight 447. Garrett rose, consolidated his possessions, and joined the queue. He presented his boarding pass to the gate attendant, who registered it with a scanner and offered a cordial wish for a pleasant voyage. He traversed 3 paces towards the jetway when Agent Ree issued the prearranged signal. The apprehension transpired in mere seconds. 6 FBI operatives materialized from the throng, their sidearms drawn, exhibiting practiced alacrity, assuming positions on either flank of Garrett before he could effect a response. One operative, a statuesque individual with close-cropped hair, articulated his pronouncements with quietude yet firmness, identifying himself as FBI and directing Garrett to remain motionless. The other operative extended his grasp towards Garrett's valise, which he relinquished without resistance. Witnesses attested that Garrett's countenance transmuted to an ashen hue. His mouth parted as if to articulate, yet no utterance ensued. The gate vicinity, previously a locus of animated commotions amongst passengers preparing for departure, devolved into abrupt silence as gazes converged upon the unfolding spectacle. Ree advanced, exhibiting his credentials and reciting Garrett's constitutional rights in a voice that permeated the concourse. Other passengers, exhibiting confusion and alarm, receded, forming a semicircular void around the site of the arrest. Offspring posed inquiries to their guardians regarding the unfolding events. Airport security personnel acted with haste to clear the immediate area, escorting Garrett through a service passageway and thereby removing him from public purview. The remaining passengers aboard Flight 447 experienced a delay of nearly an hour as FBI operatives conducted a thorough inspection of the aircraft for any supplementary materials Garrett might have secreted, though none were discovered. His valise contained the counterfeit passport, pecuniary assets, and a leather-bound compendium replete with handwritten annotations, ciphers, and contact particulars that would occupy intelligence analysts for weeks in their comprehensive decoding. Patricia Garrett was apprised of her husband's apprehension by FBI agents who arrived at her residence in Arlington, approximately at midday, on November the 12th. Their demeanor was professional, yet unvarnished, informing her that Edward had been taken into custody. Patricia, according to her subsequent declarations, initially demurred in accepting the intelligence. She maintained that a misapprehension had occurred, that Edward was a devoted American, and that whatever the FBI believed to have discovered represented a misunderstanding. It was not until she encountered her husband at a later juncture that the veracity of the assertions began to permeate her consciousness. She subsequently initiated divorce proceedings 6 months thereafter. The inquiry into Garrett's clandestine activities escalated with considerable rapidity. FBI agents executed judicial mandates to search his domicile and professional quarters, confiscating extensive documentation, personal archives, and fiscal records. The discoveries illuminated the existence of a duality in the man's existence. Bank statements revealed pecuniary infusions totaling approximately $60,000 over a 4-month span, figures substantially exceeding his governmental emolument. Concealed within the subterranean level of his abode, agents disinterred a secondary Minox photographic apparatus, supplementary rolls of unexposed film, and a journal enumerating explicit directives concerning communication protocols and clandestine rendezvous points. Within his office, they unearthed evidence indicating his illicit access to classified compendia, far exceeding his authorized cognizance, encompassing the duplication of files pertaining to NATO contingency strategies, satellite reconnaissance capacities, and systemic vulnerabilities within American early warning mechanisms. The determination of the extent of damage required several months. The Department of Defense convened a specialized task force comprising security experts, intelligence analysts, and military officers charged with the meticulous examination of every document Garrett had accessed and the ascertainment of the information he might have conveyed to Soviet intelligence. The resultant findings were sobering. While Garrett had not gained access to the most sacrosanct materials, the information he had disseminated proved sufficiently substantial to imperil multiple operations and potentially jeopardize personnel. NATO exercises scheduled for the subsequent annum necessitated significant reconfigurations. Communication protocols underwent revision. Encryption methodologies were updated. The fiscal implication, coupled with the erosion of strategic advantage, was approximated in the tens of millions. Dmitry Kuzov vanished. Within days of Garrett's apprehension, the Soviet embassy issued a communiqué announcing Kuzov's return to Moscow for undisclosed personal reasons. The State Department, in a carefully phrased declaration, designated Kuzov as persona non grata and unequivocally stated that he would be subject to immediate detainment should he ever re-enter the United States. Diplomatic relations experienced a brief escalation, with the Soviet administration repudiating any complicity in espionage activities and levying accusations against the United States for engaging in a politically motivated inquisition. These denials were universally unconvincing. Intelligence agencies on both sides of the geopolitical divide comprehended the underlying maneuverings, and within weeks, numerous American diplomats stationed in Moscow were discreetly requested to depart the country, an action widely interpreted as retaliatory. Following an initial appearance in the Eastern District of New York, the case was subsequently transferred to the District of Columbia. Garrett's juridical proceedings commenced in March of 1986. The prosecution presented an overwhelming accumulation of evidence, encompassing clandestine surveillance imagery, audio recordings of telephone conversations, testimonies from FBI agents who had observed Garrett executing dead drops and interrelating with Kuzov, and, most damningly, the classified documents themselves. Garrett's defense counsel, under the tutelage of a distinguished Washington legal practitioner named Marcus Bellamy, endeavored to posit the argument of entrapment, asserting that Garrett had been ostensibly manipulated by highly sophisticated foreign operatives and that his actions, although illicit, did not reach the magnitude of the charges levied. This contention proved unavailing. The jury, comprising 12 ordinary citizens from the Washington metropolitan area, deliberated for a duration less than 6 hours before returning verdicts of culpability on all counts. The presiding judge, an appointee of President Carter, renowned for his stringent adherence to legal statutes, scheduled the sentencing phase for May. Legal prognosticators anticipated that Garrett would receive a considerable custodial sentence, potentially for life, given the gravity of the accusations and the prevailing political milieu surrounding espionage cases in the mid-1980s. On May the 23rd, 1986, Edward Garrett stood before the tribunal to receive his judgment. He had experienced a noticeable diminution in weight throughout the trial, his countenance appearing gaunt and etched with weariness. His legal representative presented a final plea for clemency, contending that Garrett had cooperated with investigators, expressed contrition, and that his family had endured sufficient hardship. The prosecution countered with a detailed enumeration of the detrimental consequences stemming from Garrett's transgressions, including the potential endangerment of lives, the forfeiture of strategic advantages, and the imperative of conveying a definitive message to any who might contemplate similar acts of betrayal. The judge imposed a sentence of 35 years under the provisions of the Espionage Act. In his concluding remarks, the judge underscored that Garrett had violated a paramount trust, that he had bartered his nation's security for personal enrichment, and that the court bore the responsibility of ensuring such actions precipitated severe repercussions. Garrett, who had maintained a stoic demeanor for the majority of the trial, lowered his head as the sentence was promulgated. He was immediately remanded into custody and subsequently transferred to a maximum security penal institution in Pennsylvania, where he would spend the subsequent 3.5 decades of his existence. For Patricia Garrett and her offspring, the ensuing period proved calamitous. They became ostracized within their community. Neighbors, formerly cordial, now veered to circumvent them. Patricia ultimately divested herself of the residence in Arlington and relocated with Sarah and Michael to a diminutive township in upstate New York, where they resided under her maiden surname, striving to reconstruct their lives removed from public scrutiny. Sarah would later pen about her upbringing as the child of a convicted spy, recounting feelings of shame, anger, and the gradual process of coming to terms with her father's actions. Michael, in contrast, declined all interview requests and led a private existence, employed as an accountant at a firm completely unaware of his familial background. Many years later, following the dissolution of the Soviet Union, certain documents pertaining to Garrett's case were declassified. These revealed that the FBI's concerns were actually more significant than initially admitted. Internal memorandums characterized Garrett as part of a wider trend, one among several dozen American citizens who had been approached by Soviet intelligence services around the mid-1980s. While the majority had reported these contacts as mandated, a small number, including Garrett, had consented to cooperate. The documents further corroborated that the intelligence leading to Garrett's surveillance originated from a KGB defector. This individual furnished the FBI with comprehensive details concerning ongoing operations, and their identity continues to be classified. Edward Garrett served his sentence discreetly. He was not an exemplary inmate, but neither was he particularly problematic. He occupied himself in the prison library, kept to himself, and seldom had visitors. Patricia never visited, and his children made only a few visits within the initial few years, encounters that grew increasingly strained and ultimately ceased entirely. Garrett reportedly devoted a considerable portion of his time to reading, immersing himself in books on history, philosophy, and political theory, possibly seeking to comprehend the choices he had made, or simply passing the time in a life that had effectively concluded the moment FBI agents apprehended him at JFK. He was released in September of 2021 at the age of 77. By then, the Cold War was a fading recollection, and the Soviet Union had ceased to exist for 3 decades. The world Garrett re-entered bore little resemblance to the one he had departed. He relocated to a halfway house in Pennsylvania, briefly worked at a warehouse loading trucks, and subsisted primarily on Social Security. He granted no interviews, issued no declarations, and made no attempts to reconnect with his ex-wife or children, who had unequivocally communicated their desire for no further association with him. The Garrett case remains a minor detail in Cold War history, overshadowed by more sensational accounts of espionage involving higher-ranking officials and more impactful security breaches. However, for those who specialize in counterintelligence, it serves as a critical reminder that betrayal often emerges from unforeseen sources, that ordinary individuals confronting ordinary challenges can make exceptionally poor decisions, and that the repercussions of those decisions can endure a lifetime. The gentleman in the gray suit who traversed JFK on that chilly November morning in 1985 believed he was walking towards liberty. Instead, he was progressing towards the cessation of all he had known, and by the time he comprehended his error, it was far too late to reverse course.